Hello everyone, today's lecture is going to be on economic and social policy, which corresponds to chapter 14 in the book. Now, policy is of course a term that has come up countless times so far in the semester, whether we're talking about Congress, the president. So policy is just what government does. What are the outputs? What are the sort of laws that are in place? What are the programs that it administers? Things like this. So, although we've talked about it, it's an inescapable topic in pretty much every other lecture that we're talking about. Today we're going to get into some really specific aspects of it. So to start, we're going to talk about the policy-making process, a lot of which we've gone over at various points in the term so far, but we'll go over the whole thing in detail to begin the lecture. And from there on out, we're going to close by looking at specific types of policy that have a prominent spot in the federal government and talk about what those are. Things like Social Security, things like welfare policy, education, healthcare, the economy. These are all some of the really foundational core sets of policy that the federal government deals with, and these will be the ones we talk about what the federal government's efforts look like in these areas. Okay, so to begin with, let's talk about how policy is made. So, again, much of this is going to be familiar if assuming you've been keeping up with the lectures so far. We talked about how policy is made in Congress, the president's role in it, the bureaucracy's role in it. So some of this is just going to be recapitulation. To begin with, the first step in the process of making policy involves identifying a particular issue, a problem that's affecting society, something specifically that's going on that warrants government action. And the way this occurs, more often than not, the government isn't really a preventative body. It doesn't say what's going to happen a year down the road, how can we deal with it. Sometimes it does, but more often than not, policy is going to be in reaction to some problem that's emerged or is currently emerging. Important after this step, we of course have any number of issues on the plate at a given time. It's really only a select few of those that's going to warrant attention and start getting some people to really look at it in the government. And what sorts of issues do reach this threshold of getting attention and getting further down into these steps we'll talk about in a second. It varies a lot. There's not really any one particular rule. So sometimes it'll be like a specific event. You can think of one recently, like in Michigan, the federal government, prior to all the issues in Flint with their water supply, wasn't really too concerned with it, until the crisis emerged and began to be publicized. So media coverage, whenever there's something spectacular happening that stays in the news for an extended period of time. This is a real catalyst behind focusing the public's attention onto it, and then eventually, catapulting whatever the issue is into actual action in the government. And so, what do these actions look like once we get to the point where we've identified a problem? It gets it reaches the critical mass of attention. What happens then? So the first thing is that people have to start thinking of how are we going to address the issue. So we've identified a problem, now we have to identify solutions. And so depending on what the particular issue is that is being looked at, the sources of these solutions can come from a wide variety of places. Sometimes from within the government itself, people in Congress, on particular committees, may have their own ideas of how to address specific issues. Civil servants in the bureaucracy who have been working on maybe related policy areas for a decade or more, they'll often have expertise that helps to formulate solutions. Outside of government, think tanks, academics working in universities, sometimes they're given attention by the government lobbying groups, specifically if you're a really effective lobbying group and you've got your hooks into people in Congress and the bureaucracy, they can have a high degree of influence on what eventual solutions look like to emerging problems. Other types of interest groups like unions, if there's a specific specific industry that's affected unions within that industry, management within that industry. So in general, the source of thinking and solutions for a given problem can come from really anywhere. But eventually, what happens is you've got to settle on a solution or a set of solutions. And the eventual solution that gets tried is generally going to happen in Congress. This could happen maybe from a really influential member who uses his or her clout to push a particular bill as a sponsor, or maybe the committee relevant to a particular area of policy where the problem is located. Maybe they just take the reins and and go ahead and given their expertise and their authority over this topic, they determine what the solution is going to be. But ultimately, the enactment of a solution is a legislative process. So if you think back to our congressional lecture, it's going to look a lot like this. Eventually, whatever the solution is that gets tried starts out and is introduced as a bill, and then it just goes through this whole process that we talked about. And also, it's worth noting here that recall that the introduced bill in this at the start of this process oftentimes doesn't resemble what's ultimately put out and agreed upon. The ultimate bill that gets signed into law is oftentimes dramatically different. So, in terms of solutions, a bill may originate where it has a well thought out solution, and then the ultimate law that's signed into effect maybe sometimes doesn't perfectly match what was imagined. So this is one issue just originating from the fact that the enactment phase is just fundamentally passing legislation, which is a difficult process to go through. And as you probably predict, the enactment stage roughly corresponds with our congressional lecture and then parts of the presidential lecture. Those are the two branches of government that are most concerned with enacting laws. The implementation stage, though, you can probably guess, deals more with what we talked about in the bureaucracy lecture. So once Congress passes a law and the president agrees upon it, it goes usually up to a department or agency in the bureaucracy to implement it and enforce it. So the implementation stage in the policymaking process deals with the things we've talked about before. Issuing regulations oftentimes to get from sometimes vague language in a bill or a law and to put it into specific practices and guidelines to whoever the law is targeted at. If there's some benefit being distributed to deal with the problem, that's handled in the bureaucracy as well, as we've talked about. There's some enforcement that needs to go on. This will happen sometimes in departments and agencies. So again, the implementation phase. You all know pretty much everything we're talking about at this point from topics we've covered before in the semester. And finally, once we get through a solution is agreed upon, passed, and implemented, the final step in the policymaking process involves evaluation. Once this occurs, once the solution is put into effect, obviously we want to know whether it's actually working or not. And this is what the evaluation step entails. Having people monitor the situation and see if there's any improvement in what the original issue is. This can sometimes involve the bureaucracy that's overseeing the implemented solution. Sometimes Congress in its oversight role will take sometimes a direct look at what's going on. But ultimately, you want to know whether or not the solution works or not. Point being here is that if it's not working, oftentimes whatever the original issue was will reemerge. And so in this respect, the policymaking process, it's put in a list here, but sometimes the evaluation phase can lead to basically a repeat of the entire cycle to where something's not working that's being put into effect. New solutions can be found, new solutions enacted and implemented, and eventually just keep evaluating until something satisfactory happens. Or sometimes, given the nature of a problem like poverty, we want to reduce poverty. and it's generally, wherever it exists, we want to try to target it. It's a continual process of evaluation, formulation, legislation, and then implementation, over and over again for however long, until we reach utopia and there's no longer poverty. All right, so far we've talked about the theoretical steps of policymaking. For the remainder of the lecture, as I discussed at the outset, we're going to talk about some specific areas of policy that are particularly important in the federal government. To begin with, it makes sense, I think, to start with Social Security, which is actually the largest spending program in the federal government. Let's first of all talk about what is the aim of Social Security. What does it do? So this is a program started in 1935 under Franklin Roosevelt as part of the New Deal programs. So the aim of this, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is just to provide a minimum level of income to people in their retirement. So if people are unable to work, this program gives them some income so that they can afford housing, food, whatever they need, so they don't slip into a state of poverty or squalor. And the way this program works is through what's known as a pay-as-you-go funding scheme, which means those people who are receiving benefits currently, those benefits are being funded by current workers. So if you've ever heard the term Social Security Trust Fund, that's kind of a misnomer in that it assumes, or it implies kind of that you pay a certain amount of money into Social Security as you work, and that's put into a lockbox by the federal government until you retire, and at which point you begin being paid out, sort of directly what you paid in. What actually happens is that, in each paycheck, you can look at it, and whatever's listed under your payroll taxes, which you pay part of them and then they're matched by your employee, that goes into the Social Security system, and that money is directly used to fund current retiree benefits. So it's not, you're not eventually getting directly your money back. Your money's going to someone who's retired currently, and then when you retire, whoever's working then, their money's being used and applied to fund your benefits. The trust fund terminology comes into play in that there's a surplus for most of Social Security's history, such that those that are currently working, they paid more in payroll taxes than were needed to fund current benefits. We'll get into a second and show the current fiscal state of the program. It's a little bit different nowadays, but that's how the program's funded, with pay-as-you-go. Now, it's notable that it started in 1935, so it's a really old program compared to a lot of others. It's remained really popular throughout that time. There's a high degree of satisfaction with Social Security throughout most levels of society. What's interesting to note about the program, though, is that it's evolved a lot since its original passage in 1935. So if you think back to 1935, first of all, life expectancy was a lot lower back then. So people, on average, would have been on Social Security less than they are now. The retirement age is 65, which, if 65, the average 65-year-old retiree in 1935 would have had a lot less life expectancy left than the average retiree at 65 now. It's gone on and it's covered a lot more people over time than it originally did as well. So people didn't originally include farmers or certain government employees, self-employed people. It applies fairly universally at this point. Another note on the way the system works is the longer you pay in and the more money you pay in, the more money you're entitled to take out on a monthly basis when you retire. And actually, the size of payments has also increased in addition to just the number of people receiving benefits. Also in 1975, statutory changes to the program were introduced that index it to the cost of living. So if there's a period of inflation and the cost of things goes up, the payments to retirees increase in value as well in response. So this is how the program works. Let's talk now about its current state and its future prospects. So although the program is very popular in its current state, the fiscal situation makes it hard to say whether it's going to be possible to continue it over the long term in this state. So to give some sense of where the issues are arising, we talked about this pay-as-you-go system where current workers are funding current retirees. This worked a lot better in the past when there were around 9 workers paying into the system for every 1 retiree who was taking out of it at any given time. By now, there are only about 3 workers per retiree, so the ratio is going down. As you go forward, it's predicted to get down to around 2. So basically, the demographics are changing such that the fiscal situation is getting worse in the program. That's what's depicted here on this graph. So these data are showing the percentage of GDP here. Here in the black to the left, you see periods of surplus in the program. To the right, periods of deficit and eventually reaching insolvency. So here we talked about the trust fund a few minutes ago in our discussion of the overview of the program. These would be periods where Social Security is sort of building up a balance to where it can begin paying in the future. If it runs into periods of deficit, it has some money saved up in the program in order to cover the cost overruns. However, as we go forward, given the demographic changes and the reduced number of workers per retirees, you see we get into a period of more larger and larger projected deficits in the program as we go forward. And eventually, this is right here is the projected period around 2033 when all the saved up money from when we were running surpluses gets expended and there's no more trust fund left. And at that point, we're at a period of insolvency where we don't have enough money coming into the system at any given moment to pay for the benefits, and there's no more money saved up. So the big question, policy-wise, is what do you do once you reach that point? And there have been a number of solutions on either side of the aisle from this. So one obvious potential remedy is, what if we just increase the taxes? Obviously, if you increase the payroll taxes, that brings in more money into the system. There's also a cap, actually, on current taxation. So if you make over $110,000 a year, only the first $110,000 is taxed and the rest is not. So, one solution that's been proposed is either raising the rate of taxation or lifting that cap to gain more revenue into the system. Other reform efforts have been aimed at reducing the costs, so reducing the amount of benefits that are paid out in the system. Things like raising the retirement age. So it's currently 65, which, as we discussed, when the program's originally crafted, 65 is a pretty ripe old age in 1935. It's not so much anymore. So maybe raising the retirement age to reflect the current life expectancy. Maybe reducing the cost of living adjustments that we just talked about. So don't raise it as much as we do currently to index it to inflation. These reform efforts would reduce the amount of money we're spending on the program to try to get it back into balance. Another sort of separate from what we've been talking about, but a different type of reform that's been proposed from time to time is privatization. The most, I guess, frequent incarnation of this plan would allow people to take some of the money that they pay in payroll taxes, instead of applying that to Social Security, apply it to private retirement accounts, which that you could invest in a mutual fund, for example, an IRA, things like this, which would accrue value presumably over the course of your work career, and then you could draw on that in order to fund your retirement when you eventually retire and not have to draw on Social Security. So in that respect, reducing the burden on the system. This is mostly a more Republican or conservative proposal. It's others have been kind of skeptical as to its efficacy, whether it would work, whether going from a program like what we have now, where benefits are guaranteed, and then moving that to one where you're dependent on market outcomes, whether that would be a good idea. So this is a pretty contentious option. As it turns out, it's not really too relevant at the current moment. This was something that was thrown about a lot back during George W. Bush's presidency. It gained a lot of support in Republican circles back then. Obviously, Obama's not in favor of it, and even though we have a Republican president incoming, I don't think Trump has shown any indication that he's in favor of this sort of privatization. He's actually, I think, said that he, in some shape or form, wants to just keep the entitlement programs as they are. So this privatization, it's worth noting just since it's one of the more prominent reform proposals as far as Social Security goes, but it's not particularly on the front burner at the moment, I wouldn't say. Alright, so now, moving past Social Security, let's go on to a different area of policy, welfare policy. In other words, policies aimed at reducing poverty in the country. So let's talk about first, what is the state of poverty in the country? First of all, when we're talking about poverty in terms of federal welfare, we're talking about a really specific set of guidelines. So each year, the federal government puts out guidelines as far as what constitutes poverty and what qualifies you as being poor in the country given your yearly income. And it's a function of both income and the size of your family. So if you're a single person with no one else in your household, you're considered poor if your income is less than $11,770. And then you see, as the family size goes up, the poverty level increases as well. So this is to indicate that, for instance, if you have 4 children, obviously your familiar expenses are going to be more than someone with no family. So the poverty rate for 4 is $24,250 as opposed to the 11,000. So this point here, that this is how the federal government defines poverty. Everyone can, of course, have their own subjective interpretation of what constitutes being poor or not. This is how the federal government sees it, and this is what matters for a lot of the programs we're going to be talking about here. And so the poverty guidelines matter in an individual sense to determine who's eligible for a lot of these federal programs. It's also interesting to look at a broader level and to get an overall sense of where people in the country fall relative to these guidelines. So on this chart, it's showing both the number of people in poverty in the country as well as the poverty rate, dating back all the way to the 60s. And during that time, poverty rate varies between about 25% at the high end and 10% on the low end, and for the last several decades it's been within this band between about 10 and 15%. And currently the poverty rate is at about 14.5%, so it fits pretty well if you were to extend this out to the current period within the present historical trends. The poverty rate, of course, for a number of different minority groups is higher than on average. And in terms of poverty, even though the average rate may not be sort of out of the ordinary for what we're used to, in general, the government is trying on a persistent basis to try to do as much as they can to reduce poverty. We want as many people in the country to be self-sufficient and affluent as possible, beyond just the individuals who are affected by poverty. Lowering the poverty rate helps the entire country in a variety of different ways. So, there are a variety of different ways that we try to go about reducing poverty. We'll talk toward the end of the lecture about economic actions that the government can take that affect the economy in a broad sense with the aim of increasing growth and incomes in the country. There are also some specific programs within the federal government aimed at reducing poverty, so either alleviating the effects of poverty among this 14.5% or giving them the tools to try to get out of poverty. Let's talk about a few of them now. So, starting in 1935, again, this is a period where we're in the middle of the Great Depression. The government's taking on more and more roles in the economy. One of them is poverty relief. Originally, the program that's most associated with the term welfare is aid to families with dependent children. So this is a program that had a really long life cycle, dating from 1935 all the way up to 1996. When we get into 1996, though, it starts to become not too popular in the among the broader electorate. So there are widespread sentiments that it's being abused, that some of the people on these welfare programs don't necessarily deserve it, or they're not working hard enough to get off of welfare. And so in 1996, there's a bipartisan effort between Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton and the presidency and Republicans in Congress to reform this program. So the aid for families with dependent children is taken off the books and it's replaced with temporary aid for needy families. So this is a new program aimed at doing the same things as the previous program in terms of reducing the effects of poverty among those who are poor. However, it's also tied with different incentive structures. If you're on this program, first of all, you're limited in the amount of time you can be on it. The prior program, you could be on it for an indefinite period of time. This one institutes strict, firm limits. In addition, there are work requirements. You have to be constantly demonstrating to the administrative officials that are giving you your benefits that you're looking for work. If you're not employed, you're making a good faith effort to get a job. Obviously, the intent here is such that the people who are in this program eventually they get off of it and go on to support themselves in their own work. Another fairly long-standing program that is specifically aimed at reducing poverty among those who suffer from disabilities is supplemental security income. This is a program that's actually administered by the Social Security Agency, the Social Security Administration, excuse me. It isn't paid for in the same manner, though. It's paid for by general discretionary appropriation funds. This isn't what your payroll taxes are going into, but it is specifically aimed at people with demonstrable disabilities who can't really support themselves fully, giving them the aid that they need to survive. Another program that's one of the more popular and used welfare programs that are on the books, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. This colloquially known as the food stamp program, though that was the former program. The one that replaces it is SNAP. It's doing roughly the same thing in providing families that are in poverty money to go out and purchase food, basically. It's pretty much a direct subsidy on people's food spending. And then finally, the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is for people, the working poor, a way of reducing their tax burden to give them more of their money. So if you're poor, you can become eligible for these tax credits. It's basically giving you money back that you've paid in taxes. So it's increasing your income in that way, but it's letting you keep more of what you've earned. All right, so we'll get back to talking about other things that can affect poverty in a bit in terms of like healthcare and general economic policy. For the moment, let's shift over to education, though. And there are, of course, when we begin speaking of our education system, aspects of what we're talking about here are going to be tied with poverty and the state of that as well. First of all, when we're talking about the education system, it's important to know that federal involvement is a relatively new development. Throughout most of the history, up until we're going to talk about things started to change in the 1950s, before that point, the education system was left pretty much exclusively up to states and local governments. It wasn't until we get into the post-World War II, Cold War era, that things begin to happen in the world that caused the federal government to take more of an interest in the education system. Specifically, 1957, the Soviet Union starts demonstrating that it's far ahead of us in terms of their space program. They launch a satellite, which we hadn't done yet. And so this starts to become a worry that are the Soviets so far ahead of us in terms of science and technology? And are they so far ahead that it's potentially causing a national security threat, that they're going to have technologies that we don't have and we're not going to be able to defend ourselves against them? So one response to this, eventually, obviously, it turns out that they're not that far ahead of us, and in short order, we take the lead in the space race. However, in direct response, we pass an act known as the National Defense Education Act, which is kind of the first major foray of the federal government into the education system. So this is an act that provides funding at various levels of education, basically just giving money where the federal government thinks it could be used to improve various institutions. It's worth noting, I guess, at this point, I wasn't sure where to put this chart because it could be applicable to pretty much anything we're talking about in this section, that the general state of education in the United States isn't really outstanding. You see here, this is a table charting standardized test scores in OECD countries. So these are all going to be industrialized countries, most of them in the West. And you look at how we compare, we're barely in the top 25 in terms of these standardized test scores. So we could be doing better, right? So what are some of the ways that we've attempted to do better? That's what the remainder of this section is going to be talking about, ways that the federal government, now that they've started intervening in the education system, how are they trying to make it better? All right, so we talked about the door being open with the NDEA. They start funding a lot of institutions of education. One of the goals here, not just in this particular act, but in general, the federal government is to try to equalize education funding throughout the country. So getting back to what we just mentioned about the education systems in the country, for most of it being so heavily dependent on state and local governments, and still really the state and local governments are the primary drivers of the nation's education systems, this has a tendency to promote some inequalities at places. So because the localities, like county levels, for instance, this has a lot to do with funding for education. Counties that are more affluent are going to have more funding, and those that are more indigent are going to have less funding. That's just the way it'll work when you take into account the tax revenues. So one of the major goals of federal intervention into the education system involves just trying to equalize this funding. One of the really principal ideological foundations of our country's political system is equality of opportunity. Everyone should have the ability to go as far as their ability and their drive will take them. So, equalizing funding, making sure there's a minimum threshold and quality throughout the country in education, that's a major goal of the federal government. A lot of it is done primarily through the Department of Education. This is we didn't mention it specifically, I don't think, in any of the other lectures, but you would have seen it in like the list of cabinet departments. This is a department where the federal government's efforts to reach out to local and state education systems, this is where most of it's done. The funding for this department is around $70 billion a year at current funding rates, and a lot of this is then sent out to states and localities to try to equalize funding, or just in general improve the state of things where they think improvement can be made. And beyond these efforts, just strictly in terms of money and funding, a few more specific actions have been taken by the federal government to restructure the way education works. So one of these is some efforts to impose national standards that have come about in mostly the last 2 decades. So when you think back to like the 1990s and before that, there weren't any national standardized tests that are there that have any major impact on the state of education anywhere. Starting in 2001, though, this would have been one of the hallmark legislative actions of the early Bush term, George W. Bush. you get what's called the No Child Left Behind Act, which a lot of you have probably heard of. Maybe some of you, as you went through your schooling, I think it applies grades 3 through 8, something like this, the elementary through middle school periods. Maybe some of you took these tests, some of the national standardized tests that come about as a result of No Child Left Behind. So this signals the first real effort by the government to make sure that the students throughout the country have a national sort of minimal standards of performance on things like math and reading, and then putting out tests to confirm whether or not that's the case. And the effect of this act goes beyond just the simple testing. The students take the tests, and then depending on how the students in each school perform, there can be consequences for the school. So basically, the schools have a minimum threshold of performance and growth in performance they're expected to maintain. And if they don't under this act, then after a certain period of years, they start getting punished. Like after 2 years, I believe it is, this punishments start rolling in, and then they compound year after year for each year that the satisfaction of the standards is not met. And eventually, it snowballs up to the point where the administration of the schools can be replaced. The schools themselves can be closed down. There are also, even before you get to those drastic steps, like parents would have been able to opt out of failing schools and transfer to better performing schools. There would have been other programs in here and incentives to try to help the schools get to the passing standards. Ultimately, the outcome of this bill is kind of debated. I think you see some nominal increase in standardized test scores throughout its duration, but not really any dramatic overall improvement of the school system. And so more recently, No Child Left Behind has been replaced by a new act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which sort of de-emphasizes the role of national standardized testing. It doesn't totally remove standardized testing from the education system. However, it sort of moves the locus back to states and localities in terms of how they administer these standardized tests. And there's not really as many federal penalties for failing to meet the standards at this point. Another really recent example, or at least it's gained prominence in recent times, to try to impose minimum national standards was Common Core. So whereas No Child Left Behind involved imposing standards through tests and making sure students perform adequately on them, the Common Core standards would have referred each state that participated to a specific curriculum, or at least a core of curriculum, certain classes and subjects that had to be covered in the state and local run schools. So in other words, they would, I think they had things like math, reading, really the fundamental subjects. They have a specific curriculum covering them in the Common Core standards. So the purpose of this again is pretty similar to No Child Left Behind, just imposing minimum standards. This is a lot of states have adopted Common Core, but it's not universally favored. A lot of people who value state and local control over curriculum say that it's overreach by the federal government in terms of imposing the Common Core standards. I think for the most part, Common Core has been voluntarily, where it has been adopted, it's been voluntary, but there were, for a period of time, some federal incentives driving some states to adopt it, which I believe in more recent months have been reined back a little bit. So this has been sort of just controversial in the debate that it raises over federal versus state and local control of schools. In addition to what we've talked about so far, some other miscellaneous reform efforts aimed at improving education focus on sort of the types of schools and the structure of the schools themselves. The rise of charter schools has been favored and celebrated by some people who say when you allow schools to develop more specialized curriculum and practices which charter schools are able to do, and improves performance and learning among students. So charter schools have improved in prevalence and popularity in recent decades. Another maybe more controversial reform effort, school vouchers. So this is a policy that's been put in place in a few different localities. I don't think it's had really broad application throughout much of the country, but it's a set of proposed policies that would allow people who can't afford to send their students to private schools to receive subsidies from the government to allow them to take their students out of public schools and put them into private schools, where presumably they would perform better. At least that's the argument, that they would perform better. And this is controversial. Like most privatization efforts, this could be considered as a partial privatization of schools. The Republicans and conservatives tend to favor this more than the Democrats and liberals, who their counter argument is that this is taking funding away from public schools, which is where the focus should be. And I guess the evidence of the efficacy of private schools is still kind of up in the air as well. If you look at standardized test scores comparing private to public schools, I think you see that private schools perform pretty consistently better than public schools, but there's a question as to what the causality there is. Is it because the private schools are actually doing a better job teaching, and that we should have these vouchers to allow more students to go to them? Or is it just that the types of students that go to private schools are predisposed to do better in school by default, which could be, for example, because their parents are maybe more involved in their education. These, private school students tend to come from more affluent families who would put more value on education and reinforcing good habits at home. So there's questions as far as whether the private schools are actually the cause of the improved results that you see in things like standardized tests. So again, this is a fairly controversial reform proposal, the vouchers. Okay, so let's move on now to another area of policy, healthcare. Like the education system, the healthcare system is also arguably doing less well than it should or could. So this is a ranking system that's, I guess, a little bit outdated at this point. It goes back to 1997. And in 1997, I guess this is actually, I think, done in 2000, but the data are from 1997. But anyway, the World Health Organization has a number of metrics that they use to try to sort of rank and rate countries on the quality of their healthcare. Given those metrics, in 1997, this is where we would have ended up. And so, this is I should note that this isn't like a universally recognized outstanding measure. It's just one ranking that's been thrown out. And I think while the World Health Organization rankings, if you look into them, I'm not going to get too much into the debate over them, they're controversial. But just the general statement that the United States health system could be doing better than it is and has been doing, that's not really controversial. I think people on the left or the right or the center, wherever they are, most would agree that the healthcare system could be better. Where you'll see disagreement is on potential reform and different policies to improve the healthcare system, but the general state of things, I don't think there are too many people out there that would say our system is great and nothing's wrong with it. A few relevant characterizations. So first of all, in our healthcare system, about 8.6% of people don't have health insurance, and this is actually a historic low. So we'll get into talking about the current state of healthcare and why this is so low, but if you compare it to times in the past, there would have been a lot more people who are uninsured. However, spending at currently 17.1% of GDP, that's really high. It's the highest in the world, and arguably there are some aspects, despite us spending more money on our healthcare system than anyone in the world, there are some aspects that could be argued are inferior to those that are found in other parts of the world. All right, so let's talk about what the federal government's involvement in healthcare is. The two biggest healthcare programs in the country are Medicare and Medicaid. These are both programs that date back several decades to the 1960s. When these are passed, they're really the first large-scale effort where the federal government is intervening into the provision of healthcare. These two big programs, one one, Medicare is aimed at providing health care for people who are elderly and maybe aren't as able to provide for themselves given their old age and the high cost of health care that people usually have when they get older. Medicaid aimed at providing health care for those who are poor, who aren't old people, but just for whatever reason can't really afford to provide health care for themselves. And to give you a sense of the really enormous scope of these programs, these are two of really the biggest spending items and most popular, most used programs in the entire federal government. So in 2015, Medicare, over 55 million retirees are covered. The cost is over $600 billion, which is roughly equivalent to the amount of money we spend on defense every year, so a really large amount. In 2015, Medicaid, around 70 million, which I believe Medicaid is the most popular and most used program in the federal government, if I'm not mistaken. That there's no program that has more people on it than Medicaid. And its cost is also way up there, $545 billion. And it actually has increased in recent years as it's been more people have been shifted onto Medicaid as a result of the Affordable Care Act, which we'll talk about in a second. We've got an entire section to talk about that. It's worth noting here that the general aim of the programs it can be thought of as similar, just applying to different groups. Medicare is for the old people, Medicaid is for people in poverty. It's worth noting, though, that there's differences in eligibility. So Medicare is what's known as an entitlement, just like Social Security, whereby anyone over the age, the minimum age threshold, which is 65, they're eligible for the entitlement program. They're eligible to receive benefits under Medicaid. As an aside, the minimum age for Medicare is 65. For Social Security, it used to be 65 as it was originally passed. It's now been moved up to 66 for most retirees, and then it's on its way up to 67 for those that are born after a certain period. But the important part is just to note that the benefits are guaranteed after the minimum age threshold. Medicaid, on the other hand, though, is what's known as a means-tested program. What this implies is that in order to be eligible for those benefits, you have to demonstrate that your income is below a certain threshold. So the poverty rates that we showed you at the beginning of the lecture, or at least closer to the beginning, those become relevant here. In order to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to be within a certain range of the poverty level. I don't think it's exactly the poverty level, but it's maybe like 2 times the poverty level or somewhere around that. I don't know the exact number. But the level of your income becomes relevant and means-tested programs like Medicaid. Now, getting into some more recent healthcare policy, again, most people would say that healthcare costs too much in the country. That's not controversial. What's controversial is how to do so. In 2010, as you all know, probably, we've had healthcare reform passed in the form of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which is really the first major attempt to provide comprehensive health care reform, with a couple of different goals. One, reducing healthcare costs, and two, spreading coverage, improving access to healthcare among the population. So before the bill was passed, we had about 32 million Americans uninsured. Since then, as I said at the outset, it's gone down. This act also expanded Medicaid coverage, so like I said, you could now be on Medicaid even if you're above the poverty line up to a certain level. The act also mandates that everyone hold health insurance by 2014, so that's been in effect for a couple of years now, and this is probably the main big reason that coverage, the uninsured have gone down, basically, that now everyone's required to have healthcare insurance, or else they pay a $695 fine, and it makes sense that the number of uninsured go down as a result. This in combination with the fact that there are subsidy options available as well that are spreading coverage after the bill is passed. This is one of the more controversial aspects of the bill, this mandate. It's something that many Republicans and people on the right, they've said that It's not constitutional because the Constitution doesn't explicitly give the government the right to mandate that a citizen buys something. This has gone on to the Supreme Court, and the court has upheld it in their reasoning, which was a really interesting case, actually, in that John Roberts, who was up to this point one of the judges with a more conservative reputation, he votes with the majority, upholding the mandate, saying that it can be construed as a tax, which the government does have the authority to do. So in that respect, it's allowed. But still, this is a very controversial aspect of the bill. Another, maybe less controversial component is that it institutes protections for people with pre-existing medical conditions. So insurance companies aren't allowed to charge them more or deny them coverage as a result of their pre-existing conventions. Following the Reform Act, it's a lot easier for these particular people, at least, to gain coverage that's more affordable than beforehand. And as we stand right now, this is a good example of a piece of policy that's in the evaluation phase. So it's been, we've debated a number of solutions, or at least we did in the run-up to this reform effort. It's been passed through Congress, implemented pretty much in its entirety at this point, and now we're trying to determine what its effect is and whether it's had a positive effect on its stated goals. As it turns out, this has probably been the single most contentious and partisanly charged issue that we've had since it's been passed in 2010. So you can look back and as it's being debated in Congress, there's a lot of upheaval in terms of whether we should pass it or whether we shouldn't pass it. In pretty much every election since it was passed in 2010, starting with the 2010 midterms, it's been a really huge issue in campaigns from the House of Representatives, the Senate, all the way up to the presidency. It's been really a big sticking point with a lot of people. So we are in the evaluation phase, and this is probably another good example of where evaluation can differ based on partisanship. Obviously, Democrats are more pleased with how the bill has gone and affected aspects of our healthcare system, and Republicans don't really like it. As it stands now, this was an act that was passed in 2010, early 2010, back when the Democrats had a close to 60 vote majority in the Senate. I think when it's originally passed, they had 60 for about a month, and then they lose one seat after Ted Kennedy dies in Massachusetts, which brings it down to 59. But this was that's kind of not really important details. The important thing is this is passed when the Democrats have a unified government. They have both the Senate, a strong majority there, and a strong majority in the House, and Obama as the president. Now, of course, we have an incoming Republican president, and the Republicans continuing to control the Senate and the House, which they took over both chambers starting in 2014 in that election. So this is going to be a major issue in probably the first 100 days of the Trump administration. He's come out and been pretty emphatic that he wants to get rid of this, the Affordable Care Act, and replace it with something else fairly quickly. So this is going to be really interesting to watch in the coming months to see what eventually comes out of that effort. The final area of policy that we're going to talk about in today's lecture is economic policy. And this is a pretty broad area, just to stay in general economic policy. So let's first of all start by defining what are we looking at in the economy to determine whether or not it's doing good. What are the measures that the government looks at that it's trying to influence one way or another? In general, I think three of the measures we're going to talk about here are among the most important that economists would look at, if not the three most important. First of all, unemployment. This is a pretty commonly used indicator to determine whether or not the economy is doing well. This is just, to put it as simply as possible, the percentage of people who are looking for work that are unable to find work. The way this is calculated is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who every month field a pretty extensive national survey to try to determine how many people are working, how many people aren't working, and among those people who aren't working, are these people actually actively looking for jobs or just out of the workforce permanently? And so the unemployment rate, as it's usually reported, is that rate of people who specifically are looking for work but can't find it at that moment, who aren't employed. As it stands right now, it's at 4.9%. This is about within broad historical trends. Typically, this rate is somewhere between 4 and 6%. Obviously, we would want it to be lower. You want unemployment to be as low as possible and as many people working as can and want to work. A second measure of economic performance is inflation. So this is, again, to put it simply, how much everything costs. Is the cost of things increasing? Is it decreasing? What's going on there? The most commonly used measure of inflation is known as the Consumer Price Index, which every month the government goes out and surveys a basket of goods that are commonly consumed by people, so things like food, clothing, common medical services, just to get a broad look at the price of products that people tend to use most often in the economy. And they chart the price of these various goods in this basket to determine how they compare to last month and last month before that, and basically what the rate of growth is in pricing. Generally speaking, the most desired outcome as it pertains to inflation is price stability. So right now, our inflation rate is at 0.2%. So meaning the month-over-month change in prices isn't really that dramatic. Pretty stable inflation rate right there. And the reason we generally want stability is that when you think of if inflation is going up at a really high rate, that's obviously undesirable. That means things are becoming more expensive and people are able to consume less goods with their money. So that we don't want that. On the opposite hand, it's generally not really desirable to have a period of deflation either, in other words, negative CPI, because although that in theory allows people to get more for their dollar because prices are going down, at the same time that's reducing the incentive of producers to produce. So when the price of goods go down, or whatever you're producing, you don't get as much money for it. The laws of economics say that you're going to reduce the amount that you're producing just because you're not getting as much, and there's not as much incentive there. And that's a bad thing in the economy too. We want production to be high, so we don't really want the CPI to be overly low, and we don't want people's dollar, on the other hand, to lose all of its value. So we don't want the CPI to be too high. Generally, we want a really nice and low inflation number. And the final economic measure that we're going to be talking about is growth. So when we say growth in the economic context, we're talking about how much is production changing in the overall economy. So, adding up the entire amount of goods and services produced in the economy, is it going up? Is it going down? What is it doing? Obviously, it's desirable to have more production in the economy, and the most commonly used metric of growth is GDP. So GDP standing for Gross Domestic Product, just a way to calculate the value of all of the goods and services produced in the United States over a certain time frame. Most commonly, it's measured on a quarterly basis, year over year. So if you look at our current GDP rate, 3.2% for Q3 2016, the way to read this is that compared to Q3 in 2015, gross domestic product in 2016 Q3 is 3.2% more. So you have to compare the year-over-year value. If you were to just look at quarter over quarter, you're subjecting yourself to quarterly effects whereby, for instance, Q4 is just naturally subject to higher GDP on average than Q3 because of like the holidays and whatnot. So there are quarterly effects such that it makes more sense to look at things year over year rather than comparing different quarters. And our current rate, 3.2%, that's right around what's generally historically considered acceptable. It's about average. If you get below that, you start to run into growth that's not really too robust, and people start to get concerned about maybe a general state of lethargy in the economy, and start considering what can be done to energize it. Now, getting into that topic, what can the government do to influence the economy? Given these three things we just talked about, we want low unemployment, relatively stable price levels, and then high growth. What does the government do to try to influence these three different factors into a favorable manner? First thing we could talk about here is monetary policy. So this is basically policy pertaining to the supply of money in the economy. So the United States government, obviously the Constitution gives it the authority to coin money. Monetary policy involves how much money is out there and how is it exchanged. The body that has pretty much exclusive authority over monetary policy is the Federal Reserve. So this is a group that's not really directly taking orders from Congress or the presidency. It's meant to be more independent so that the monetary policy of the country isn't really that subject to partisanship and the whims of politics. So we have a separate, somewhat independent group there to set our monetary policy. And the things that it can do to affect this policy are pretty varied. So if you ever hear about interest rates being set in the Federal Reserve, so this is where like each bank has to have a reserve requirement that's found in the Federal Reserve. They have to, in other words, set aside some money that they're not lending out that's just available there in reserve. So the Federal Reserve sets interest rates that pertain to that in terms of the rate at which banks lend to other banks their Federal Reserve reserves, the rate at which the Federal Reserve lends out money to other banks, and these rates we don't need to get too much into the details or the economic principles behind them, but basically these interest rates that the Federal Reserve set oftentimes heavily influence what the actual consumer interest rates are that banks offer to people and businesses ultimately. And when these interest rates are low, that has the effect of making money more available, so more people will take out loans because they're cheaper to take out. This can sometimes have a stimulating effect on the economy. The Federal Reserve can also change reserve requirements such that if banks are allowed to take money out of the reserves and set less aside in the fractional reserve system, lend more, this can increase the amount of money that's in the economy as well. And also open market operations are where the Federal Reserve, in order to take money out of the economy or put more money into the economy, they can buy or sell government bonds. So if they're buying bonds, they're putting money into the economy. So in other words, they're taking their money and then using it to purchase these bonds, which are only guaranteed payouts at a future point in time. So in other words, injecting money into the economy. On the other hand, they can sell bonds, which takes bonds that they already have, where people will pay them for it, and then they'll take that money, which comes out of the economy. So in this way, they can affect the money supply. In a general sense, when the Federal Reserve needs to stimulate the economy, they'll do these sort of things that expand the money supply. On the other hand, the difficulty here is a balance to where if you have too much of an expansive monetary policy, you risk running inflation. So when you get to the point that the economy seems like it's doing better on its own, the Federal Reserve will start trying to rein in some of these policies designed to stimulate the economy, like raising interest rates, contracting the money supply through open market operations, and in this way try to avoid any inflation that will come as a result of their expansionary policies. All right, so now whereas monetary policy is pretty much the exclusive domain of the Federal Reserve, fiscal policy is controlled through pretty much the traditional government mechanisms we've discussed so far in the semester. So fiscal policy derives from a bill that's passed through Congress and then has to be approved by the president. And when we're talking about fiscal policy, we mean either spending money or manipulating the tax code in order to stimulate the economy. this will be done through, on one hand, you can spend more money, take money from the federal treasury, and put it into the economy. And according to certain schools of economic thought, this will have a substantial degree of impact on growth in the economy. On the other hand, lowering taxes, it reduces the amount of money the government takes in, allows people to keep more of what they're earning, people and businesses, and some portion of this additional money that they're keeping is going to be spent in the economy, which again, certain schools of economic thought would say this is going to have a substantial degree of impact on the economy and improving it. The downside here is that if you do this too often, spending and then lowering taxes, this can sometimes result in deficits and then the accumulation of debt. And over the long term, this keeps going on and on. Debt, the higher it gets, the more expensive it is to maintain and pay off the interest every year. And if it gets past a certain point, your ability to borrow any further can be impacted. So over the long term, it's not generally that wise to always be running deficits and debts, even if it can sometimes have a beneficial effect on the economy. One final approach to the economy that the government can take that's worth mentioning briefly is the laissez-faire approach. And so this is the stance, basically the government should be hands-off. People who adhere to this belief would say that things like price stability, employment, growth are better served when the government doesn't intervene in the economy. And so not getting into whether or not this is sound, the important thing here is that it's not really politically practical in most cases. Since the 1930s, as I've mentioned on a number of different occasions, the expectation in the public is that when there is an economic issue or a crisis, that the government should do something. So when you're someone in Congress or the president, if you want to keep public sentiment with you and keep it positive, it's really hard to just take the approach of we'll stand back and let things play out, even if you are of the ideology that this would be the best approach to things. Alright, so that concludes the lecture on economic and domestic policy. I'll see you guys next time for the discussion on public opinion.